Hello, welcome to the UX Tea Break, and in this episode I argue why you should stop selling user experience. So this question comes from, a number of people really. Here's an example of the way it's phrased from Maria Ruddy. Working with your senior stakeholders so that they understand the value of UX research time. Another one here from Libby Heisman. How to best convince executives of the value of UX. Another version from Chloe. Any suggested resources for cost justifying research and usability. Another example from Yola Zuka. Strategies to make companies see that UX research is a valuable key along the process. Now, I hear this a lot, and I can understand why people want to make sure that their senior managers get user experience. I'll talk about some ways of doing that, but I also hope to convince you that it's a fool's errand. If you find yourself in this process, you're already on a losing wicket. If you find yourself having to justify the work you do day to day with your senior stakeholders, it's time to find another team or another company. First of all, let's review some of the ways you can do it. So first of all, we could look at this particular source. This is a book called Cost Justifying Usability. This is the first edition. There's a more recent edition where the authors, Randolph Bias and Deborah Mayhew, have updated it for the internet age. It was published in 1994, and I hope to convince you that's where it should stay. We shouldn't be having to do that kind of thing these days. Now, some of the ideas they have in the book, and it's got some terrific resources. It's got things like spreadsheets that you can use. It's got equations you can use. You can calculate, for example, the salary of an internal user, multiply that by some number, take away another number, and then the result gives you exactly what the benefit would be financially of doing user research and design on a particular project. And there are other techniques as well. Another one would be to find out, for example, the stakeholder you're trying to convince, what's the key metric that they're interested in. Maybe it's, for example, they want to reduce returns. Maybe they want to reduce rework that the project team are having. Maybe they want to increase the number of users that they have for a particular system. If you identify that, you can then work out, what are the user research and design activities I need to do in order to move the needle on that attribute. So all of those are kind of the obvious ways of doing it, but I think they're all wrong, and I'll tell you why. Because based on my experience, so I first started working in the field in 1989, and at that time I worked for a company called BT, and they had some research labs that I worked at, and I carried out my own research. In that instance, sometimes it was on the prosaic to do with using colour in displays. Sometimes it was more looking forward. I was looking at telepresence at the time. But what I needed to do with my research results was then convince project teams that they should use them on devices that they were creating for BT. I had zero success. After leaving BT, after about 6 years, I worked for a consulting firm where my job was to sell usability and human factors to clients. I did try cold calling at one point. I had zero success. In about 2001, I set up UserFocus, and I've been there for nearly 20 years now. And as part of that process, I continually have to write proposals and sell the idea of why usability should be done on a particular project. But it's never expressed I've never been able to express it with a logical argument that wins. So if I need to fall back on these logical ways of convincing people they need to do user experience work, it always fails. I don't know why it always fails, but it always fails. When it always succeeds, or when it often succeeds, is when the person that is interested in the work has got some intuitive belief that it's the right thing to do. So, for example, they may have released a product and it's been a dog. It's been a complete failure. They just didn't understand what the user's needs were, or there was some fundamental problem with the product, and they realize, we should have usability tested this. Then people are more receptive to the idea. It's as if the people that you work with, they need to have had a disaster to realize how this thing matters. Because after all, these people don't ask marketing to cost justify their work. They don't ask developers to cost justify why they should write code. Why are people in user research and design forced to cost justify the work that they do? I'd argue the reason people are asking you to do that is because they don't think it's very important. They basically are trying to get rid of you and they're using that as an excuse. What you need to do instead is wait for that project team or for that company to have a disaster, and then you can step in with the appropriate work. Alternatively, you could join a company that's already further up the maturity ladder, because it is about UX maturity. At the top of the UX maturity ladder, you have firms that are doing this kind of thing every day. For them, you don't need to justify the work. They know exactly what you need to do and you'll slot in. Firms lower down the UX maturity ladder, well, at the very bottom, they don't even know what user experience is. But just above that, they've had some kind of disaster and they're trying to get into the field. Now, the great thing about this is if you're a practitioner, that's a good place to start, because it's a bit like a football coach taking over a team that's at the bottom of one of the lower divisions. There's only one place to go, and that's up. In contrast, when you work with a firm that's got a lot of UX maturity, you have to do a lot of work in order to move the needle on what matters to that organization in terms of UX. So if you're working at a company that is low on the UX maturity, it's not as bad as it sounds, because you can move the needle there, but I recommend that you don't go about trying to sell the idea of user experience to them with these cost-benefit arguments. Instead, find someone that believes users are important at a senior level, that believes that it's important to listen to users and use them as a way of kind of bootstrapping the work that you do and making that happen in your organization. Well, I don't think that was the answer that you were after, but I hope you found it useful. If you did, please give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel.